The Empire of Japan lasted just under 80 years, from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 to the post-war Constitution of 1947. In that time, Japan transformed from a relatively isolated feudal society into an industrial power, an imperial state, and eventually one of the Central Axis powers of World War II. Its story is not simply one of military expansion. It is also about modernization under pressure, political change, nationalism, industrial growth, colonial rule, devastating war, and post-war reconstruction. At its height, the empire controlled not only the Japanese home islands, but also Korea, Taiwan, Karafuto, the Kuriles, Okinawa, and other dependent territories across the Pacific. By 1945, after defeat, occupation, and surrender, that empire had collapsed, leaving behind the foundations of modern Japan. The empire began with the Meiji Restoration, a political revolution that restored formal governing authority to the emperor after centuries of rule by the Tokugawa shogunate. The change followed the Boshin War, a conflict between forces loyal to the old shogunal order and those who supported imperial restoration. But the new government was not simply reviving an ancient monarchy. It was building a modern centralized state. Japanese leaders understood that Western imperial powers had forced unequal treaties on Asian countries, and they feared Japan could suffer the same fate if it remained weak. The slogans of the age captured the goal clearly: enrich the country, strengthen the armed forces, and promote industry. Modernization became a matter of national survival. Meiji Japan moved with remarkable speed. The government reorganized administration, created a conscript army, expanded education, built railways, encouraged factories, and adopted Western-style legal and military systems. Samurai privileges were reduced, social classes were restructured, and the state promoted industry as a national project. This was not modernization in a peaceful vacuum. It was deeply connected to military strength. Leaders believed economic development and armed power had to advance together. Japan studied European empires and borrowed institutions selectively, adapting them to Japanese priorities. The result was one of the fastest modern transformations in world history. Within a few decades, Japan had become strong enough to challenge neighboring powers and demand recognition as a modern imperial state. As Japan modernized, it also expanded. Imperial Japan acquired Taiwan after the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and Korea was formally annexed in 1910 after years of increasing Japanese control. Southern Sakhalin, known as Karafuto, came under Japanese rule after victory in the Russo-Japanese War. Japan also controlled the Kuril Islands and later gained influence over Pacific Island territories through the South Seas Mandate after World War I. Some territories were treated as internal parts of the empire, while others were legally dependent territories or concessions. For Japan's leaders, empire promised resources, strategic depth, markets, and prestige. For colonized peoples, however, Japanese rule often meant political repression, cultural pressure, economic extraction, and forced assimilation. The empire had three emperors: Meiji, Taisho, and Showa. But the emperor's role and the nature of political power changed over time. Under the Meiji Constitution, sovereignty was tied to the emperor, but actual decision-making involved ministers, military leaders, bureaucrats, elder statesmen, political parties, and court influence. This makes the empire difficult to describe with a single label. It was not a simple personal dictatorship in the style of some 20th century regimes, because there was no single dictator controlling every institution. Yet by the 1930s, the system increasingly displayed militarism, authoritarianism, political repression, and state control. Scholars have described it in different ways, including militarist, totalitarian, parafascist, corporatist, or police state-like. The 1920s were a turning point. Japan had experienced growth and international recognition, but it also faced economic instability, social tensions, and political conflict. The Great Depression worsened these problems, hitting exports and rural communities especially hard. Many people lost faith in party politics and liberal compromise. Military officers and nationalist thinkers argued that Japan needed unity, discipline, and expansion to overcome crisis. They promoted the idea that the state should dominate society, that political dissent was dangerous, and that Japan had a special destiny in Asia. Civilian leaders became increasingly unable, or unwilling, to restrain the armed forces. Step by step, the empire moved toward aggressive militarism. Japan's expansion on the Asian mainland intensified with the seizure of Manchuria in 1931 and the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, full-scale war with China erupted, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces achieved major battlefield victories and captured important cities, but they could not force China into complete surrender. The war became long, brutal, and draining. During this period, the Imperial Japanese Army committed severe atrocities and war crimes. The most infamous was the Nanjing Massacre, in which Japanese troops killed large numbers of civilians and disarmed soldiers, while widespread sexual violence and destruction occurred. These crimes remain central to historical memory and regional tensions today. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Japan's leaders were trapped between ambition and shortage. The war in China consumed enormous resources, while the United States and other powers opposed Japanese expansion. Japan joined the Axis alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, hoping to strengthen its diplomatic position and challenge the existing world order. When tensions with the United States escalated, Japan faced oil embargoes and strategic pressure. Rather than retreat from its empire, Japanese leaders chose a risky military solution: strike quickly, disable Western power in the Pacific, and seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. This decision led directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a dramatic tactical success but a disastrous strategic gamble. Japanese aircraft crippled much of the American Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii, and in the following months Japan achieved rapid victories across the Asia-Pacific. It advanced into Southeast Asia, captured Western colonies, and threatened Allied positions across a vast region. These victories created the appearance of unstoppable momentum. But Japan's empire now stretched across enormous distances, requiring shipping, fuel, aircraft, trained pilots, and naval protection on a scale it could not sustain indefinitely. The United States, with far greater industrial capacity, mobilized for a long war. Japan had won time, but not the decisive victory it needed. The turning point came in 1942. At Midway, American forces destroyed several Japanese aircraft carriers, weakening the naval power that had enabled Japan's early victories. At Guadalcanal, a long and brutal campaign showed that the Allies could stop Japanese expansion and begin pushing back. From then on, Japan increasingly fought defensively. The American-led island-hopping campaign targeted key islands while bypassing others, cutting Japanese positions off from supply and reinforcement. Over the next 3 years, Japan lost many of its Pacific Island possessions. Its merchant fleet was devastated, cities faced bombing, and shortages deepened. The empire that had expanded so rapidly was now being compressed toward the home islands. By 1945, Japan's situation was desperate. American forces captured Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, bringing the war dangerously close to the Japanese mainland. Japan's navy had been shattered, its air power weakened, and its cities were increasingly exposed to bombing. Allied planners prepared for a possible invasion of mainland Japan, expecting massive casualties on both sides. Then, in August, the crisis intensified further. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, destroying Japan's hope that Moscow might mediate a negotiated peace. At nearly the same time, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing overwhelming destruction and human suffering. Japan now faced catastrophe from multiple directions at once. On August 14, 1945, Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration and agreed to unconditional surrender. The next day, Emperor Showa addressed the Japanese people by radio, announcing the decision to end the war. The formal surrender took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. With that, the Pacific War ended and the Empire of Japan effectively collapsed. Allied occupation followed, led by United States General Douglas MacArthur. The Imperial armed forces were dissolved, political institutions were restructured, and reforms reshaped Japanese society. In 1947, a new constitution came into force, officially ending the imperial system that had begun in 1868. Modern Japan emerged from the ruins of empire. The post-war settlement transformed Japan's place in the world. The Treaty of San Francisco took effect in 1952, ending the occupation and restoring Japanese sovereignty, though some territories remained under separate arrangements. Okinawa, for example, was returned to Japan only in 1972. Japan's old imperial military was not restored. Instead, the Japan Self-Defense Forces were created in 1954 under a new constitutional framework that rejected war as a sovereign right. Emperor Showa remained on the throne until 1989, but the emperor's political role had fundamentally changed. The history of the Empire of Japan is therefore a story of astonishing modernization, violent expansion, devastating defeat, and a dramatic reinvention after 1945. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.